Gotcha.
All right, Mr. Hinckley, we were just taking a roll and we hear your voice, so we hear that you're on the meeting. Being that we have a full commission today, there will be no need to excuse the absent members. The chair will, so we'll skip that. Approval of the agenda. Are there any additions or deletions to the agenda for the Wednesday, May 12th, 2021 meeting? Mr. Hinckley, Ms. Hanning, have you had an opportunity to review the agenda? And Ms. Hanning, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine, Chairman Moore. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Hanning. Mr. Hinckley, Mr. Hinckley, can you hear properly? I think Mr. Hinckley's having some issues hearing. Can you hear Mr. Hinckley? Looks like he's having some difficulty with his audio.
Hello, hello.
Mr. Hinckley, are you able to hear properly? Mr. Hinckley? Looks like Mr. Hinckley's having some issues. Let's hold off just for a sec for him. So just bear with me for a second.
Hi, Mara. Am I dead or are we hearing things or what's going on? Oh, but you can't hear. Oh, okay. So it's my speakers that are the problem, huh? Okay. Yeah, now I'm unmuted, according to me. Unmute.
Mr. Hinckley, this is Jennifer Curran, and we can hear you now. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can now. Just came through.
Good.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what went wrong there, but all right, I muted and unmuted and that seemed to help.
Mr. Hinckley, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Chairman Moore. Okay, very good. Well, let's see. We knew you were attached. We could see you, but we knew you couldn't hear us. So we did call roll.
Okay, well, I'm now here a little late.
That's all right. We'll get through this.
Thanks for your patience.
Oh, not a problem at all. And every member of the commission's here today. Okay, online. We don't have any excused members. I'm going to continue the meeting here. And then approval of the agenda. Ms. Hanning said that didn't have any questions or comments, additions or deletions. Okay, Mr. Hinckley.
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Speaker and Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve the agenda as published.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hinckley. We'll go ahead and take a vote. Ms. Hanning?
Aye.
Mr. Hinckley?
Aye.
Mr. Spiegelberg?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy?
Aye.
And myself, aye. Thank you. The agenda for today's meeting has been set with no changes. Approval of the minutes. Are there any corrections to the minutes for the April 14th, 2021 meeting?
Subject to any, Kennedy here, subject to anyone else's corrections, I move to approve the minutes as published.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Hinckley. So we have a motion to approve the minutes from last month's meeting. I'll go ahead and take roll. Ms. Hanning?
Aye.
Mr. Hinckley?
Aye.
Mr. Spiegelberg?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy?
Aye.
Chairman Moore, myself, aye. Motion carries. Move on to item number 6. Our disclosures. The chair will call for any disclosures to be known to the public. Ms. Hanning, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I'd like to disclose that my husband and I are contiguous property owners to LUC-04-21. And I do not believe I have a conflict of interest, and I can remain fair and impartial.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. And I, as chair, don't see that you have any conflict of interest, and I think you'd be just fine voting on this item. Mr. Hinckley, any disclosures?
No, I have no personal or professional relationship with any of the applicants.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Spiller?
None.
Mr. Kennedy?
Point of order, I would like to make a motion to limit public debate on every issue to 3 minutes per person on all public comment. And if I can get a second, I'll make a comment.
That would seem premature as we're in the middle of disclosures. Can that motion wait?
That was a point of order.
Do we have a second for Mr. Kennedy's
I would
point of
so
order?
second.
Okay, discussion. Mr. Kennedy?
I think to be fair to everyone today, given the length of the agenda, that we ought to limit public comment to 3 minutes per person, and realize that duplicative testimony other than I support or I oppose this is kind of, someone has new points to make. I think those are very important to be heard, but we've all read through a lot of material at this point. And with that, I would call for the question, absent other comments.
All right, Mr. Hinckley, do you have any comments to that? More discussion to add?
Well, I'm not averse to limiting debate to 3 minutes apiece. I would maintain that this is a point of order. It's out of order and it's a motion on the floor that should get discussion at the appropriate time. I have no objection to controlling our debate. We've got a very full schedule. So that'd be my only thought is I think we're out of line.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hinckley. Ms. Hanning?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the need to limit the length of public comment, given the high interest in some of the issues on the agenda tonight. I guess my question is for you, Mr. Chair, since I'm a couple months new to the commission. When you've had to limit time in the past, has it typically been 3 minutes? Is that sort of your standard practice?
Yes, Ms. Hanning, thank you for your question. And I would say that I think that would be appropriate when we get into public applications, because we do realize this is going to be a lot of a lot of public comment, and we're here to listen to the public, and that's what we do. But also we have a job to get done, and what I have done in the past is I have limited to 3 minutes on certain topics. And anybody listening from the public, it'd be nice that if it's something that somebody has already said, then we would appreciate it, so we get through business, that you just say, I echo those comments, and add if there was something that was an omission. Currently, we kind of follow the Board of County Commissioners, because the Board of County Commissioners do limit it to 3 minutes per person. Otherwise, we're not going to get through our packet, and we're going to have to schedule those, just due to statutes. When people file applications, we're required to hear them and give the applicants the right to have their applications heard. And so with that being said, I feel that 3 minutes is appropriate for each speaker when we do go through public comment. Now, however, that and being the chair, I can also make the determination that we can allow somebody else to speak a little longer. And what I'm saying with that is, and I've done this in the past before with people like Mitch Edwards, who he is representing a group of people, and instead of each individual member of that group coming up and taking 3 minutes, they're hiring an attorney. And so I would allow for that in those situations. But for the most part, we do have business to get through, and I do think that comments and points can be made, whether you are for or against a public application. And anybody in the public who's listening is when you do comment on it, please let us know we are for or we are against. We don't need a lot of people rambling on about stuff and not getting to the point. Sometimes we ran into it where at the end of somebody speaking, we don't even know if they are for or against what the public application is. Mr. Spiegelberg, do you have any comment on the time allotment?
I would kind of echo your comments on that, Sean. We have been deluged with conversations, letters, all kinds of communication. And I think if somebody has something new to add, that's fine. But anything else that's redundant, I think is just taking up time.
Mr. Spiegelberg, any other discussion? All right.
Call a question.
Go ahead, Mr. Kennedy.
Call a question, please.
Okay. We'll go ahead and vote on this. Ms. Hanning,
Aye.
Mr. Hinckley,
Aye.
Mr. Spiegelberg,
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy,
Aye.
and Sharon Moore, myself, aye. Back to disclosures, we have gone through 4 members of the Planning and Zoning Board, 5th being myself. I too also have an exposure. And just so everybody that is aware that's on this meeting is the Rogers Canyon LLC zoning change application, LUC-04-21, is the applicant is Dwayne Toro, and I do work with Dwayne Toro. And in no way am I tied to this application financially or any benefit to my business and real estate. We are all independent contractors. He's just the brokerage that I work with. So just so everybody knows that, and I think that I can be impartial in the decision making of this application. All right, that being said, moving forward, the discussion today will be conducted in accordance with the state statutes, the rules of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and other applicable laws. I would ask individuals who address the commission during the public comment period to, and because we are on Zoom, please raise your hand and I will either call you by name if it shows up, or if you're on telephone, I will say your phone number. And when it's your turn to speak, please state your name and your physical address, and we get in our minutes and have that for records. I would ask everybody that please make sure that your microphones are muted when you're not speaking, and we'll try to conduct this meeting as the best we can. We want everybody from the public to be able to speak, and that's why we do have that limit. And we do want to hear from everybody. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and move on to public applications. The first application is the Osborne zoning change application, LUC-02-21. And I see here that is Joe. Joe, would you please go ahead and give us a backstory, or you can give us the details of this application. We did hear it last month, but we did have one member that wasn't present last month, so I think it'd be good to go through it again.
All right. So like you said, this was tabled at last month's meeting. The applicant is Osborne Concrete, located at 1 Cottontail Drive. The current zoning is small lot residential, and they're looking to change the zoning from small lot to urban residential. Current use is residential, and the property can be accessed off of Cottontail Drive. There were 4 reviews and nobody had any concerns. Notice has been provided by signed publication and certified mailings as required. The applicant has provided the required site plans and/or survey. The proposed zoning change generally follows the suggestion of the Albany County Comprehensive Plan, including but not limited to the long-range growth plan and priority growth areas. This property is in priority growth area 2. The applicant has addressed all impacts. We just say that wastewater will need to be following the Albany County wastewater regulations, and 7 Mile Water District needs to give permission to the extra taps, which they have. Findings of fact. The findings necessary for approval as listed in this report are incorporated herein as findings of fact. The property is currently zoned small lot residential. The property is in priority growth area 2. The applicant wants to make this into a 4-lot subdivision, which will require an urban residential zoning. Upon acceptance of this proposal, the applicant will need to complete and turn in a subdivision application to the county planning office. 7 Mile Water District needs to give permission for the additional taps. The applicant has provided a complete application and has addressed the potential impacts this may cause. Conclusions of law, the applicant is proceeding in accordance with the requirements of the Albany County zoning resolution. The staff analysis is this property is in priority growth area 2, which would allow for an urban residential zoning. Impacts to the surrounding area will be minimal. The applicant has provided information that ensures the impacts and nuisances will be minimum. Our staff recommendation is to approve the Osborne Land Use Change Application LUC 0221 based upon and incorporating the findings of fact and conclusions of law as stated in the staff report.
Thank you, Joe. Do we have any questions from members of the commission? Mr. Hinckley.
Yeah, in the staff report, it as before has the statement, impacts to public services will include 4 connections to septic and water facilities. That, as we have since learned, is incorrect. I'd just like to see that stricken from the staff report, as it is a misleading statement and misses an important point of the situation. Then by way of a question, I noticed that we have, there's some contingencies in here. Has 7 Mile given the required permission? I think the answer is yes, but perhaps it would be good to have that on the record.
Yes,
Is that correct, Joe?
Yes, they have.
Okay. So I think your report, it states they will need to get that permission. So they have obtained that. And then for those who didn't perhaps get the email, I had also had the opportunity to ask the city about that, as they are the supplier. And they too concurred that they would find a small addition to the 7 Mile Water District to be an acceptable expansion of the city system. So I have no other comments for staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hinckley. And yes, I did receive your email and appreciate your diligence working on that. Now it's great information to get. Ms. Hanning, do you have any comments or questions for for Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'll repeat my comments from our last time that we discussed this. And I just also would like to point out that in the meantime, there was a public comment received by an adjacent landowner, I believe a ranch owner, who said that he wasn't for this zoning change. So I just wanted to make sure that's part of the record. So I won't be able to support this because it is going to septic tank leach fields, and it's already a small lot size that I already think we have evidence both within our county and all across the country that septic tank leach fields can lead to groundwater contamination in densely populated subdivisions like this one already is. And so I cannot with good conscience support going to a smaller zoning size, knowing that already there's probably groundwater contamination to the state waters there. And I guess I feel like trying to make an important zoning decision like this without knowing all the other things about how the environment will be protected with the smaller subdivision. All that sounds like it's supposed to come later. And to me, I feel like that's a bit like putting a baby in the bathwater and checking the temperature after you put the baby in. Like, it seems like you can't decide about the environmental integrity of the project if you're waiting to do those studies down the road. So I just wanted to reiterate from our last discussion where I'm standing on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. Do you have any questions for staff? Okay, thank you. Mr. Spiegelberg, do you have any, we of course have heard this before. Do you have any questions for Joe on this application?
Well, I do have a comment, I guess. First of all, the city letter implied that there was a error in the existing zone. And I asked David Gersh about that, and he said, no, that's incorrect. It was correctly stated in the packet. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is that I read here in the packet is if this, say this were approved, the DEQ would still be involved studying the risk to the aquifer and the septic systems and so forth and so on. And thirdly, I recall when this spur well was.
John, we're on the Osborne land and zone.
I'm sorry.
change.
I'm sorry.
So the Osborne application.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
I'm an error. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
I'm sorry.
Any questions for staff though? Any questions for staff for Joe?
Yes.
Okay.
I did receive a letter just today, and an adjoining property owner was questioning. He didn't even know about the decision to rezone or anything. Was that person notified as an adjacent property owner?
He was, yes. We have the certified mail receipt that they did receive it.
Okay, well, the implication was that the way I read it was that he hadn't been notified, and I know your office has been very, very accurate and dedicated in informing adjacent property owners, so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Spiegelberg. Mr. Kennedy, do you have any questions for Joe?
None, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kennedy. And myself, I also do not have any further questions as we heard this application last month. At this point, would the applicant or applicant's representative
Chair, Commission, this is Jake Schneider with WWC Engineering. I am the applicant's representative for the Cottontail subdivision.
Yes, sir. Go right ahead. If you want to,
yeah,
if you want to address the commission, if you want to give a background on it, that would be fine, or whatever you like to, however you like to handle that. But go right ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Chairman. I would like to. The planning staff has done a very good job of describing the project. I won't take up too much of your time. I would like to. So I listened to the last planning and zoning meeting and kind of extracted a couple of questions from that meeting, and I would just run through these real quick and answer those questions, and hopefully it'll give you a little bit more understanding of what can happen out there. As far as the future development capacity of the 7 Mile Water District, it's constrained to 52 service taps by an agreement with the city of Laramie. With these 3 additional taps, because there is 1 existing tap to this property already, so we're proposing 3 more. That'll be a total of 48 taps to the system. So after if the Cottontail subdivision is approved and those lots are developed, there will only be 4 more available after the Cottontail is allocated. So it can't supply any more service connections than 52. As far as the water quality impacts, the water table is about 9 to 10 feet deep to terrace deposit the first sort of water level. And we did some water quality analysis on that. The sulfates in that groundwater are 1,860, so it's defined as a class 3 water. Potable water is limited to 250 milligrams per liter. So it's significantly higher than what would be potable from a sulfur perspective. We have sampled that water for the nitrogen. We've gone through the Wehrman model as described in DEQ Chapter 8, Chapter 23, and Chapter 25. And based on our analysis, it does not exceed the DEQ limit of 10 milligrams per liter of total nitrogen. It obviously, like Commission Member Hanning said, it is going to impact the water a little bit, but it still stays within that threshold of 10 milligrams per liter. And we do have to go through all of the DEQ process, and it's pretty onerous to make sure that our development is not going to negatively or overwhelmingly impact the water based on the DEQ limits. And in the event that we do have impacts more than 10 milligrams per liter, we would propose an alternative septic system where we could get those nitrates down. As far as the 7 mile agreement to provide services, they did decide that on the March 21st meeting, and that is in their meeting minutes that they are that they approved to provide water or service to these lots. Existing groundwater wells, there's 3 upwell gradients. Within about 700 feet, we attempted to contact the landowners, but we never heard from them. So what we did, we ended up digging a test pit per Chapter 25. We've already gone through the percolation testing requirements in as described in that DEQ regulation. And we then that's what we based our Wehrman model calculations on. We have one well that is down gradient. It's about a mile away, but it terminates into a deeper formation. There is, so the first terrace deposit of water is, like I said, between 10, 15 feet deep. And then below that, the next, based on our geological information that we have reviewed, the next water bearing formation is about 2,000 to 3,000 feet deeper, somewhere in that range. You know, it's several thousand feet deeper in their shale in between the two. And I think that's, I won't spend too much more of your time discussing this, but I think those are the questions that were raised in the previous meeting. And I appreciate your guys' time to let us to kind of have some conversation here on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. I have a few questions from any commission members. It looks like Mr. Hinckley, you have your hand up. Go ahead and ask Mr. Schneider a question.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, if you'd prefer we use the raise hand feature, I don't know what works best for you. I don't see what you're seeing. Is that all right if we just wave, or should we use the?
Excuse me, and I apologize, and thank you, Mr. Hinckley and Mr. Schneider. Maybe I wasn't clear. On the participants roster on the right side of your Zoom, or if you haven't had it pulled up, it's on the bottom and you pull up participants. There should be a column with everybody's name who's on the meeting. And at the bottom of that, there are 3 buttons that say invite, mute me, or raised hand. And Mr. Schneider, I appreciate your politeness because you're such a nice guy. But when I say raise hand, just raise it on the scroll on the right. But you're good. You're muted right now. But anyways, we'll get back to that. Mr. Hinckley, if you would go ahead and ask Mr. Schneider the questions that you have for him.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Schneider. Those are valid insights, and maybe if we had seen that Chapter 23 or Chapter 25 study, it would have made a difference. I thought Mr. Kay's comments were relevant. Apparently, there was a miscue on whether he'd been notified or not, but it sounds like Joe solved that for us. But he raised 2 issues. One was what we might call septic overload, given the the condition of the soils out there, I'm concerned that they cannot accommodate more septage, not from a Weirman nitrate model point of view, but just from a volumetric point of view. If you're telling me that it's alluvial deposits down 9 or 10 feet, that's relevant. To Commissioner Spiegelberg's comment, DEQ has a very narrow analysis here. These things that we call the Chapter 25 studies there's nothing about cumulative impacts, and we'll get to that probably in some of the later applications. But no, we should not simply say DEQ's got that all under control, because they look at some very specific things in a very specific way. The other thing that Mr. K. Brent mentioned was flooding when he irrigates, and perhaps the applicant's representative could speak to that. I've been involved as an expert witness in half a dozen of these situations where somebody builds a house out in the middle of flood irrigated agriculture and lawsuits ensue. So can you speak to either of those concerns?
Chair and Commission, thank you. Yes, I can speak at least specifically to the second concern about the flooding. The location of and the kind of the topography of the area kind of generally tends towards the sort of the Laramie River and towards town, away from the property. So if they're going to be flood irrigating, it's not going to go up to that area, and as is required by Chapter 23, there are some water rights that are associated with that, and we are in the process of filling out a SEO application to vacate those. But the property is up gradient from the flooded irrigated lands, so it should not impact it from a surface perspective.
And is the gravel
2 to 3 feet higher?
Okay, no, that's great, because if he were flooding and it came across the property, we're just setting ourselves up for something. But describe that first 9 to 10 feet. I guess it sounded like that's permeable alluvial gravels. Did your test pits and so forth show that to be permeable, or were you on the margin for getting your perk rates high enough?
No, it was permeable soils. It was fine grained, sandy-ish type soils.
Thank you.
And the deeper we got, the more it resembled sort of a clay or a gyp sort of material that had a little more plasticity to it. The upper stuff was pretty granular.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Ms. Hanning, do you have any questions for Mr. Schneider?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Schneider, for all your diligence in tracking down some of that information about nearby well users and the TDS of the water right there. I still remain concerned about that kind of density of septic tank leach fields, but I really appreciate all of the effort you went to track down those details. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. Mr. Spiegelberg, do you have any questions for Mr. Schneider?
None.
None from Mr. Spiegelberg. Mr. Kennedy?
None.
And no questions for Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, thank you for entertaining us and giving us more information to make this, and appreciate your time. We might call on you a little later if there's any other questions or discussions that we have and some answers that we might need. So stick around here. With that being said, at this point here, I'll go ahead and open up this application to public comment. If there's anybody that's a member of the public that would like to comment on this application, now would be the time. And like I said before, please raise your hand on the right side of the column under participants, and raise your hands, and I'll call on you and give you the opportunity to speak. And we'll go ahead and right now we're opening it up to public comment. I'll give a few seconds, a minute or so for everybody to have that opportunity. Not seeing any hands up, and I see Miss Hanning lowered her hand. Thank you. I'll go ahead and close this application to the public. At this point, I'm gonna go ahead and ask the commission what they'd like to do. The options are either make a motion for recommendation for approval of the application, a recommendation of denial, or and I don't necessarily think, and David, you could help me on procedure, or Ms. Curran, but we have tabled this one from last month. So I believe if we table this again, or I don't believe that we're able to table this again, correct?
Yeah, I'd have to check, but yeah, we only have I think we have 45 days from the time that an application comes to us to make a decision on it. But I'll double check that real quick here.
Well, thank you, David. So at this point, I'm looking for a motion from members of the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Kennedy here. Mr. Chairman, I move recommendation of approval. And I'm sorry, I lost my page here. Of the Osborne zoning change application LUC-02-21, incorporating the findings of fact and conclusions of laws listed in the staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Do we have a second?
I would so second.
Okay, so we have a second from Mr. Spiegelberg. So we have a first and a second discussion for members of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Mr. Hinckley?
We're under discussion of the motion now, are we?
Yes, we have a first and a second. And before I call a vote, is there anything or any items that we need to discuss or that would like to be brought up in light of the motion? Because we have a motion, a recommendation for approval at this point. Anything
no, I understand. So yeah, I guess the point now is the discussion of the motion. And my understanding of our procedure in general is to have a staff, we'll ask them questions, we'll have the applicant ask them questions, and then our discussion can take place following that once we have a motion on the floor. So in that spirit, I would echo some of the concerns that Commissioner Hanning raised. I'm not averse to some additional lots out there, but I'm resistant to the idea of urban residential zoning. I think that should be reserved for things adjacent to town that are really consistent with the growth pattern of the larger communities. So I will not be supporting the motion, although I'm not unhappy with the idea of a couple of lots there. Thank you. That's where I stand.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hinckley. Appreciate that. Ms. Hanning?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also will not be able to support approving this application for the zoning change. Not only am I concerned about, I guess, our findings necessary for approval, number 3, paragraph E, natural and environmental resource impacts. I don't believe that you can make a finding of not having adverse environmental impacts to natural and environmental resources. Sorry, I don't do well talking and reading at the same time here. I don't feel it meets that, but additionally, I also want to echo Commissioner Hinckley that I don't believe that it meets number 2 of findings necessary for approval, that it does not generally follow the suggestions. I know there's suggestions of the comprehensive plan. The only PG2 area in all of the comprehensive plan that seems to anticipate urban residential zoning is just in the south of Laramie area, right along city limits. And I don't think it's appropriate to start putting urban residential out in locations like this PG2 area where there will not be sewer coming to this area for a very long time, if ever. So I can't support this because I don't believe we're making the findings necessary for approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. Appreciate your comments. Mr. Spiegelberg, any discussion? None from Mr. Spiegelberg. Mr. Kennedy?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's very important that we remember that what governs our action on an item is the zoning ordinance, as well as state statutes, and not necessarily things that are just what we believe to be personal opinion. And secondly, we do rely on DEQ to make some study, and that is after the zoning change, but prior to the preliminary and final plat. And so I think it's only fair to the applicant that we go ahead and look and let them do that. And with that, in the absence of the chairman's comments, I'd call for the question.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I too would have to, Mr. Kennedy, and I do see Ms. Hanning's point. And you did have a good comparison with the baby in the tub, but with this being just a zoning change, we have to remember this is just a zoning change. Before anything happens on this property, we're going to have the necessary requirement for all the findings that we're going to put the developer through and make a decision on that based off facts and information from the correct bodies like the state DEQ and things of that nature. And so this is a zoning change. And, with your analogy, it was a good one, but I think before you throw the baby in, you test it with your hand. And that's what we're doing here is we're looking at a zone change. We're testing it. We're going to get more information. And when we get more information based off of the actual plat, and if those requirements are met, I think that we can make an educated decision at that time. But that's my only comment on that. I'm going to call for a vote. Ms. Hanning, do you have another question? I see your hand still up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for entertaining my question, because I know the vote was called and you don't necessarily have to hear me. I guess I just want to ask everyone to consider that as soon as you give permission for a zoning change, you're essentially giving permission to that property owner then for all of the rights that go with that zoning change. So it seems like looking at one of the other items on our agenda tonight, it looked like if they had come in with their zoning separate from the subdivision, we would have approved a zoning change and then found out that there were a lot of concerns from other reviewers about that becoming a subdivision. So I guess I put a whole lot more importance on this particular stage in the decision making, in that if somebody really wants to demonstrate that their zone change is really going to meet our requirements, then maybe they need to come in concurrently and show all of that. But I feel like we're giving people permission to be granted allowable uses as soon as you grant that zone change. And you're doing it without knowing a lot of important details. And I'm glad you like the baby in the bathwater analogy. I had to work hard on not coming up with something possibly offensive, but everybody likes a baby. So anyway, thank you for entertaining my final comments.
Absolutely. Appreciate your comments, Ms. Hanning. At this point, we'll go ahead and call for a vote. Mr. Hinckley?
No.
Ms. Hanning?
No.
Mr. Spiegelberg?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy?
Aye.
And Chairman Moore, myself, aye. So motion carries. The Osborne zoning change application passes, and it'll move on to the Board of County Commissioners. Move on to the next application, which is the Roger Canyon zone change, LUC-04-21. And it looks like this one's Mr. Gertsch Mr. Gertz, would you please go ahead and brief us on the details of this proposal?
Absolutely. So the applicant for this project is Roger Canyon LLC. This is located on Roger Canyon Road, directly across from the Sunset Acres subdivision, which is approximately 4 miles north of Laramie. They're requesting a zoning change from agricultural to small lot residential. The land right now is currently vacant. Access to the property will be off of Roger Canyon Road, a county road. Roger Canyon Road is, which is a county road. And there, let's see, so there was a number of folks that reviewed this. There were no concerns with this application from the reviewers. Notice was provided as required. So the findings necessary for approval, they provided the required site plans for this. The comprehensive plan, basically this shows this area as a priority growth area 3, which is a priority growth area 3 is an area, or is areas of the county that have existing development but are outside of the Laramie urban growth area and water districts, and have been identified as relatively growth efficient places to direct future development. In general, PGA 3s are contiguous to existing development nodes, at least within half a mile of existing development in areas more characteristically rural or on the outskirts of urban areas of the county. And since these properties may only be served by on-site septic systems, they're generally large lots with small family homes, possibly with small convenience-oriented commercial uses. The future land use map does show this as agricultural. There's the growth efficiency is a measurement of relative proximity to different elements of public services and infrastructure that are needed to support development. And then long-range growth plan land use objectives is to promote development patterns that are growth efficient and logically sequenced to efficiently served by public services, direct development to specific areas, facilitating this by phasing infrastructure and service investments, and fulfill needs for various kinds of housing and employment opportunities for current and future development. This is also a portion of this property is within the Casper Aquifer Protection Area, and the CAP identified residential development as a potential source of aquifer contamination. And then with all these applications, a number of impacts were addressed by the applicant. I'll just note that this proposal is consistent with the existing residential development that abuts it, including Sunset Acres to the east and Kuhn Acres to the northeast of this proposal. And natural resource impacts, the applicant addressed that. So that's all I had comments on. Ultimately, after review, all of these impacts have been sufficiently addressed by the applicant. Findings of fact, the findings necessary for approval is listed in this report or incorporated here in as findings of fact. The applicant has provided a complete application and addressed potential impacts from this zoning change. In conclusions of law, the applicant is proceeding in accordance with the requirements of the Albany County zoning resolution. This application was removed from the April 14th meeting. This is my analysis by the applicant. The development, they're proposing 14 lot subdivision with approval of this zoning change application. And the proposal is across the road again from Sunset Acres and then Kuhn Acres. Sunset Acres has over 30 lots in that, and then Kuhn Acres, that's a 3-lot subdivision that abuts the northeast corner of the project. This is within the Aquifer Protection Overlay Zone, and so because of that, and because it's zoned agricultural, will require site-specific investigation if the subdivision application is submitted to ensure that vulnerable features are identified and any potential impacts are mitigated. Wastewater systems in the Aquifer Protection Overlay Zone require plans certified by a professional engineer. In addition, Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality will review this subdivision, anything that's over 3 lots, DEQ reviews. And because this is in a priority growth area 3, which is an area designated for future growth, the comprehensive plan supports future development in this area. And this proposal appears to comply with the county's adopted plans and regulations. So with that, the staff has recommended approval of the Roger Canyon land use application. And I'd be happy to answer any questions on this property. I know the applicant is online as well if you have questions for him.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. First, we'll go with questions of you. I'll go ahead and call on people. Mr. Hinckley, do you have any questions for staff?
Yeah, I have a question, and then I also had just some comments on the findings. Would you prefer those wait, or should we have that discussion now, or should we confine this to just questions? What's your pleasure?
Yeah, you can go ahead and have some questions for Mr. Gertz and any comments that you might have.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the first is a specific question, and it goes to some of the discussions we've had on some earlier applications in terms of the staff analysis. I'm reading, for example, under economic impacts, the applicant responded they would have positive impacts, quote, to address the housing shortage, unquote. And my question, it's true that is what they said, so the finding is correct to that extent. Do you, the staff, agree that there is a housing shortage that this usefully addresses?
I can say that right now, I know that there's very limited houses on the market. We haven't done an actual housing study to base anything off of, but I know that we've always had a shortage of housing, at least since I've been here. So I don't have any problems with what the applicant responded there.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'm wondering if somebody's going to say we should do this to address a housing shortage, I would like to see some evidence that there is a housing shortage, right? So you've offered us the staff's advice that there is in fact a housing shortage, and this might usefully address it. Okay, then as far as the actual content of the findings of fact, I disagree with quite a number of those. I don't think it is compatible with surrounding land use. That's purely a matter of where you stand. If you look west, you find ag ground. If you look north or east, you find residential development, but at nearly twice the lot size. So I would quarrel with the statement that it is consistent with the surrounding land use, or that it is consistent with the comprehensive plan, which suggests in areas like this that large lot subdivisions are more appropriate. Further, it is not compatible with the Aquifer Protection Plan, which also recommends that we move towards large lot subdivisions on the APOZ rather than actually moving in with a smaller than even residential lot size. Let's remind ourselves that the applicant is asking not just for rural residential, but for small lot residential. It is stated that the property, your staff report noted that a portion of the property is within the Aquifer Protection Area, which is correct, but I would point out that that is one area where the Aquifer Protection boundary is known to be in error. And I use the word in error to mean inconsistent with the stated criteria for the boundary, which is the famous 75 feet. And that's been known ever since the spur wells were drilled in the early 2000s. The report suggests that a site-specific investigation will need to be provided to address any impacts. Again, I think that overstates it, and it harks back to the discussion we just had on the 7 mile. It is true that a site-specific investigation would be required, but I would note that the county has zero experience with requiring site-specific investigations. If this were to go forward and one were required, it would be the first one ever that is required. Further, the statement that an SSI addresses any impacts to the Casper Aquifer is not correct. If you read the county regulations carefully in terms of what an SSI is supposed to do, it is a determination of mitigation measures as a result of the presence of vulnerable features on the improvement site. I think this is a significant deficiency in the current county regulations, but that's where they are. And the SSI is not even tasked with the more general mission of what are the impacts on the aquifer. It is targeted to these vulnerable features. So it is questionable whether that would in fact provide the solace that's being offered here. So it's and I'm resistant, as Commissioner Hanning said on the previous program, to we'll figure it out later, let's proceed. Similarly, your analysis notes that the subdivision would require a Department of Environmental Quality review, and perhaps somewhat in disagreement with Commissioner Kennedy. That review has no accommodation whatsoever of cumulative impacts. It's very narrowly defined on a particular square of ground. Those reviews, I think, are useful in the right context, but they are not adequate to be addressing the items of concern when we're talking about cumulative impacts, which are of particular relevance on the Casper Aquifer. I would also, in that vein, point out that the DEQ, and we'll get one of those, has an adverse recommendation later on in our agenda today, but the DEQ does not, they only provide a recommendation, and their most severe recommendation is put in enhanced septics. So they are not a go, no-go decision-making body and don't have the authority to be one. Finally, we are offered as a finding of fact, quote, the applicant has addressed the potential impacts this use may cause. That is simply not true. The staff report does, but the applicant completely ignored the fact that the subdivision is being posed on the aquifer. So it is not true by a stretch that the applicant has addressed potential impacts this use may cause. And that in itself causes me concern that this applicant is not particularly sensitive to the environmental impacts of the proposal. So with that, I'll close my review of the staff report. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Hinckley. Ms. Hanning? Any questions for staff or any additional comments you'd like to ask at this point?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I do have some questions for Mr. Gertsch. Mr. Gertsch, I guess I feel like I want to support your staff on pushing back a little more on applicants when they come in with an application that I think is lacking. You recognize that the site is in the APOZ, but the applicant didn't. And nor was the identification of the type of residential zoning made. It's just called all residential when there's quite a bit of difference between rural residential and small lot residential. So I just want to mostly let you know that I support you on going back to the public when they give you an application that's a little bit lacking and asking them to do a redo. So I won't repeat everything I already repeated about the Osborne site, except to say, well, I guess I want to ask you, Mr. Gertsch, why or what do you think about this being located so close to the city spur wells? Like, did that cause you a moment of like, oh no, not another thing coming into the APOZ?
Well, I'll just say that I don't know which way the water flows in that area. I don't know anything about the geology of that area other than a portion of the property was an aquifer protection overlay zone. Again, I mean, I feel like we would find out more information once a site-specific investigation was done, and you know, the DEQ did their investigation, their permitting. Because as staff, it's like all I know is that there's a line there. I don't know what exactly it means for the spur wells. I know that they're close, you know, and obviously this is something that I pointed out that it is in that area and where those are located. But I'm not a scientist. That's why we need further information to really have an opinion on it, at least in my case. So.
Okay, thank you. I guess another question to ask. This would be the first time that I can see in looking over all of the zoning maps that are posted online where small lot residential would be located out in PG3 area. I mean, whether you call them PG3 from the comprehensive plan or not, if you just look at our county and you look at those little growth nodule areas out there, like Albany and Centennial, there's been a certain amount of small lot residential growth that's happened out there. And that was all considered to be PG2 kind of area in the comprehensive plan. And this, I guess I just wonder if you can show me an instance where there's small lot residential in an area that is strictly PG3.
So, I mean, I could tell you that there are small lot residential properties in PGA 4, which is actually less, that's for bigger lots. All of the Sherman Hills area is PGA 2. I'm trying to think. We've had some small lot residential stuff. I think actually one of your applications, it may be tonight will be another request for. Well, actually that's PGA 1, but a number of the areas like the South Laramie area, a lot of lots we actually have urban residential in that area. Obviously there's water available, but there are some other areas that are smaller lots. I'd have to go back and do an analysis. I can't tell you off the top of my head. Sorry about that.
No, thanks. I think you're validating or verifying my cursory look at the maps. Is that the southern portion of city limits of Laramie is really where that concentration is expected and planned for, and thought to be more appropriate. I guess my last question, Mr. Gertsch, I'm just wondering where do your staff fall in thinking about the septic tank leach field study that Wenck and Associates performed, I don't know, a couple of years ago, which showed that septic tank leach fields in small lot residential lead to groundwater contamination. And so I just wondered, what does your office think of that report? And do you apply the lessons learned when you see applications like this come in?
We apply what's in the regulations to our applications, and our understanding of what the regulations say. That has not been put into practice. I mean, what was gleaned from that information. While I support that study and everything that was done, and I feel like they did a good job. One of the things that the state required of us, and this came up in another meeting I had recently, is that was not to be used for policy decisions until we had additional.
His mouth is moving, but I have no
that
sound.
is one project.
And I don't want to leave the meeting because then I have to read.
Sorry, just a second here.
Mr. Gertsch, hold on one second. Miss Brand,
This happens to me all the
Miss
time.
Brand, can you hear us? Let's see, she's muted.
I muted
Go
her.
ahead, David.
Okay, so yeah, that report is just one report and one soil type. So we know what happens in that specific soil type, and we have some information on that. But we don't have that other. I mean, it's like anything else. If you put a pin right here, a pin, and you put a pencil on it, you can only go one way, right? It's going all over the place, whatever. But if you have another pin and you put that something across there, it's strong. We've got one witness that this is how it is, and while I think that was a good study, I think we do need more information to really apply that. And like I said, it's not something that we have translated from policy into regulation at this point, and we were asked not to by the state.
Thank you, Mr. Gertsch, for explaining that. I guess I just would ask you to take into consideration that there's ample evidence out there in USGS reports, EPA reports, NRCS, I think we can go on and on, all the different agencies that have also borne witness to septic tank leach fields resulting in groundwater contamination when their density is too close together. And I think we have evidence in our own community that 2.5 acre lot sizes are not protective of groundwater quality. I don't think our basin is that heterogeneous that you can't extrapolate from this study to a lot of the rest of our basin in places along the APOZ. So I just hope you'll take into consideration that there's a lot of evidence out there that says these are not protective of the environment, and therefore it makes it hard to approve make the findings of fact on this being an appropriate zoning change. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. I appreciate your comments. Mr. Spiegelberg, do you have any comments?
I'd like to ask Mr. Gersh a question. Lately, this issue of fertilizer has been surfacing as an objection to approvals of various applications and so forth. And I read thoroughly through all the regulations. I see nowhere in our regulations any control over fertilizers. And I presume that they're referring to this fertilizer like you put on your lawn. And I've heard accusations and speculations that, oh, this is going to ruin the aquifer. It's going to do this, do that. Well, I don't think we're here to speculate with things that really aren't even in our regulations. I think that's wrong. And it's the other thing is I'd like to just mention at this time is that I read a letter from the city, and they act like it's a very, very vital source of water for the city of Laramie. But I guess I'm a little older and been here a little longer than most of you have in Laramie. I've been here all my life. And I recall about 20 years ago, there was a big conflab about buying the Monolith Ranch water rights. And that kicked off a big investigation. Oh, is Laramie going to have enough water, this, that? So they started doing these experimental wells. And one of those experimental wells was Spur Ridge Well. And that was strictly at that time, it was an experimental well. And according to the other data we've had here presented to us, is that that well has to be recharged. They have to shut that well down and let it reach an agreement to that effect to protect the well owners right across the street there. And I guess it's the Sunset Acres and so forth. So I kind of refute the idea and the statement that this spur well is so vital to the city of Laramie's water. I don't buy it, looking at the evidence and the facts and so forth. But getting back to this fertilizer issue, I just think it's wrong to bring issues up that are not in the regulations. I think it's a waste of time and speculation, and that's the way I feel.
Thank you, Mr. Gerch. Mr. Kennedy, do you have any questions for staff?
None.
And no questions from Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Spiegelberg, you have wishes?
Yeah, I did direct my question initially to Dave. To your knowledge, are there any regulations regulating just standard fertilizers like you put on your lawn? This has surfaced now a couple of times, and it's irritating to me because I don't see anything to back it up, and I don't see where it's a regulation that we should even be concerned about.
So to answer your question, John, we do have those in the Aquifer Protection Overlay regulations. And ours basically say that they need to follow the label, the instructions on the label. That's about the extent of them. So.
Can't quite hear him.
Thank you, David. All right, Mr. Gertz. I see two hands up, Mr. Hinckley and Mr. Showaker. And Mr. Hinckley, if it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and call on Mr. Showaker because I think he would be one that could attest to some real estate questions. Mr. Showaker?
Yes, can you hear me?
We sure can, Mr. Showaker. Go right ahead.
Okay, as far as the housing shortage is concerned, I would agree with that statement. Currently, from what I've seen on the MLS, which I keep track of very closely, at this current point, there are single-family homes available that are under contract is 16. Townhomes is 2 and condos is 3, which is well below the normal inventory of what you would see in a normal market. So yes, there would be a housing need.
Thank you, Mr. Showaker. Appreciate your insight. Mr. Hinckley, I see your hand is up. Go right ahead.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Mr. Showaker. That's always useful for us to learn from our esteemed county's assessor. Don't mean to argue the point, but let me just clarify a couple of things that we just went through. To Planning Director Gertz's point that we need more information and that will be provided to us through an SSI. And the agreement that Commissioner Spiegelberg alluded to with respect to the spur well is a, and they mentioned it in their comments, it's an unfortunate agreement that the city got into with the local homeowners way back when they drilled the spur wells in the early 2000s that requires curtailing use of the spur well if the water levels drop below certain threshold values. As I said, I think it was an unfortunate one because there is really plenty of water in the spur aquifer, but I think the city is technically correct that any increased use of the aquifer in that area increases the possibility that they will have to curtail under that agreement because it's keyed to water levels. So one, there is such an agreement and it's real, and there is the possibility that additional use of the aquifer could trigger some burden on the city. And to the SSI point, there is nothing remotely like that asked for or considered in the SSI. So let us not think that the SSI is going to solve all of these problems and bring all this information to the table. It's a very specific study, and that's a good example of something that wouldn't ever even enter the universe of SSIs. The more important point I would like to make is, and with all due respect to Commissioners Hanning and Director Gertz, about the WENC study, and that came up Tuesday as what little I heard of the commission meeting. There are 2 different WENC studies. One of those was a study done to confirm that the laws of chemistry and physics work the same in the Laramie Basin as they do in all the rest of the world, i.e., there is a certain nitrate loading accompanying septic systems, and that's universally true. Most states, every state I've looked at has a number that they use for their calculations of what the nitrates concentrations below septic systems are. That includes Wyoming. So there was a specific study done at one specific, and that number is 40 milligrams per liter for the state of Wyoming. There was a study done on one septic system, as Mr. Gertz pointed out, in Sherman Hills, that came up with a number of 55. So that's a study, and it had some parameters associated with it. Set that completely aside, get it out of your minds. The study that is being referred to here was a study that WENC did for the city on nitrate loading. And it simply looked at, if you took the entire APOZ and developed it at certain lot densities, what would be the predicted concentration of nitrates? They did that using their own 1-point study, fair enough, at 55 milligrams per liter. They also ran the numbers using a concentration of 40 milligrams per liter, which is the Wyoming DEQ standard and is the standard across much of the United States, where the standard isn't 50. So the restrictions on that first study of you can't use this are irrelevant to this discussion. The point was that they calculated if we continue to develop the aquifer at certain lot densities, we will eventually reach the point where the nitrates are in excess of the federal standards for drinking water supply. And that conclusion is not constrained by any agreement with DEQ or under any 1-point, 2-point, 12-point science. It was simply a mass balance applying known numbers to known areas. So we should be perfectly clear that study stands on its own 2 feet. And it's a very simple study that simply says, if you continue to develop subdivisions at these low densities on the aquifer, you will eventually overload the aquifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hinckley. No comments from myself or staff. So at this point, we'll go ahead. If the applicant or applicant's representative would wish to address the commissioner staff, now would be the opportunity.
This is Dwayne Torrell. Can you hear me?
We sure can, Mr. Toro. Go right ahead.
I'd like to thank you folks for everything that you're doing. I'm available for any questions that you may have.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Toro. Any questions from the commission for Mr. Toro? Ms. Hanning? No questions. Mr. Hinckley? None. I see you shaking, nodding your head, none. Mr. Spiegelberg?
None.
Mr. Kennedy?
I have one question, and that would be, from what you've looked at the maps, what would you estimate the percentage of the acreage that is in the current APOZ?
Are you asking me that, Mr. Kennedy?
Yes, I am.
It looks to me like, of course, that it's my understanding that delineation line's never been surveyed, so it's a guess. But it looks to me like probably about 10 or 12 acres.
All right. Thank you.
And no questions for me. Thank you, Mr. Toro. At this time, and we might call on you again to answer some questions here when later, also if you just stay available for us, and you can go ahead and mute your mic. At this point, we'll go ahead and open this application up to public comment. And so anybody who wishes to speak from the public, please address the commission. Please state your name and your address, and please raise your hand on the right, and I will call on you. And I'll give a few minutes here for people of the public. I see one from a Mr. Paul Taylor. Paul, can you hear us?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Mr. Taylor, go right ahead, please.
Okay. You can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Paul Taylor, 612 South 8th. And I'm here speaking on behalf of Aqua, the Clean Water Advocates. And we've sent in a number of, or a letter with a lot of details about our concerns, and we oppose this change in zoning. This is a really sensitive area, and we think that we need to be really careful about these developments and moving into the future. And I think a lot of those issues have been raised in the concerns already raised here, and we support those too. So we would strongly oppose this Roger Canyon change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, for your comments. Diana Kokornik, I see your hand is raised.
Hi, yes, I'm Diana Kokornik. I live at 24 Antelope Avenue.
Yes, go right ahead.
I concur that this is too dense for this location. That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Kokornik. Appreciate your comments. Is there anybody else in the public that would wish to speak on this application? I see Matthew Burkhart. Mr. Burkhart, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mr. Burkhart, this is the public public comment period for the Roger Canyon LLC. Do you have a comment on this application?
Yes, I concur that the change to small lot residential is inconsistent with the tone and tenor of the rural residential, the larger residential subdivision and lots around this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Not seeing any other hands up at this point. I'll go ahead and close the public comment portion of this application. And I don't know, Mr. Hinckley, would you prefer to have discussion before anybody makes a motion, or would you want to have discussion afterwards?
Entirely up to you, Mr. Chair. I was simply trying to accommodate your wishes in terms of the order of events. No, I don't have a preference on whether. I think we've aired it out quite thoroughly in the spirit of questions of staff. So I feel kind of there, but as you please.
Okay, very good. Well, at this point, are there any other questions? Mr. Kennedy or Mr. Spiegelberg, any questions for anybody?
None.
Okay.
None.
And Ms. Hanning, any other questions or comments?
No, thank you. I'm set.
Okay, very good. At this point, I'll go ahead and we've heard from the applicant and the staff, and we've heard from the public. At this point, I'm looking for a motion, either a motion of recommendation for approval of the zoning change, a recommendation for denial of the zoning change, or tabling this application. Mr. Spiegelberg?
Yes, I would recommend approval of the Roger Canyon zoning change application, LUC-044, down to the Board of County Commissioners, incorporating the findings of facts and conclusion of law as listed in the staff report.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Spiegelberg. We have a motion. We have a motion to approve. Do we have a second?
Second, Kennedy.
And we have a second from Mr. Kennedy. So we'll go ahead and call the vote. Or any other discussion? We have a motion for recommendation for approval at this point. Ms. Hanning?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't be able to support this motion because I don't believe that there's the information for making the findings necessary for approval. Starting with number 2, I don't believe that this proposed zoning change generally follows the suggestions of the Albany County Comprehensive Plan. You don't see small lot residential in areas that far away from the city typically, and it wouldn't be appropriate here. And regarding the findings under number 3A, compatibility with surrounding properties, all of that land across Roger Canyon Road is zoned agricultural, and it's used agriculturally. You know, the Warrens run cattle on the land. And so it's in use, and the Warrens have been benefiting from the not being fenced out of this triangle of land. So they've been lucky. But it's all agricultural over there, and it makes sense to be agricultural. And in fact, I used to have a neighbor who moved away when he found out how restrictive our covenants are. He probably would have loved to buy that parcel and vied for the state land permit to run cattle on it. And now with our own slaughterhouse in town, it's a pretty good gig, I would think, to be able to raise cattle that close to a slaughterhouse. So I don't think putting small lot residential is compatible with the surrounding properties, as well as with the rural residential lot sizes across Roger Canyon Road, let alone the agricultural. So I don't think it provides a consistent pattern of development. as it is when you come out Roger Canyon Road and you get past the landfill, you go by really large parcels of land, and then you come over a bend, and all of a sudden you see sunlit hills, and it's I think a fairly dense subdivision for being in the APOZ, so I believe that already the residential development out here is probably already impacting groundwater. So I can't support it because of the consistent pattern of development, nor can I support it because of the natural and environmental resource impacts to the groundwater resource that we've already talked about. But in particular, I think the potential impacts to the Spur well field, whether the wells started out their lifespan as experimental, they're now an integral part of the city's water system. And given the University of Wyoming getting rights to drill new wells near to existing city wells, I see the Spur well field as becoming even more crucial to the city. And the city, I mean, think of the infrastructure costs that they bore to put in 6 miles of conveyance pipes and a treatment system out here and 2 wells. I mean, I just don't see that the benefit gained from 14 households in alleviating some of the housing issues we have and adding to the tax base. I just don't think that measures up to the threat to the public welfare of locating dense subdivision with septic tank leach fields next to the city well field. And I guess lastly, because I have a lot of work experience where I've seen groundwater contamination from septic tank leach fields, I really believe it's irresponsible development to put such a densely populated subdivision with septic tank leach fields that will someday that'll lead to groundwater contamination. And then that's going to be a burden on those homeowners to have to figure out how they're going to get on either a advanced treatment system or get on a sewer line to run it over the wastewater treatment plant downhill from this area. But I think that's shifting the burden onto these future homeowners, and it's irresponsible for us to approve this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. We'll go ahead and call for a vote on this. Mr. Hinckley?
No.
Ms. Hanning?
No.
Mr. Spiegelberg?
Yes.
Mr. Kennedy?
Yes.
And Chairman Moore, myself, yes. Motion carries. This will move on to the Board of County Commissioners. We're going on to the next public application. The next public application is C, which is Vista Beam, Herrick Lane Tower Application, LUCT-01-21. Joe, go ahead.
All right, the applicant is Inventive Wireless LLC, DBA Vista Beam. The location is in section 35, township 17 north, range 76 west. The request is for a tower permit. Current zoning is agricultural, current use is residential, and there is an existing access off the Dutton Creek Road. Albany County Fire and Albany County Assessor's Office both had no concerns. The engineer, Bo Gorman, said that the applicant should use an existing approach to Dutton Creek Road if possible. If not feasible, applicant should obtain an approach permit from Road and Bridge and construct at the approved location to Albany County standards. Rob Fisher, superintendent of Albany County Road and Bridge, had no concerns unless a new access is needed, in which case an approach license would be needed. And Wyoming Department of Transportation, Ryan Shields, the district traffic engineer, said any work within the YDOT right-of-way would need to be permitted through YDOT District Maintenance Office. All notice has been provided. The findings necessary for approval. The proposed tower shall not adversely affect public interest. The applicant has provided the required site plans and/or survey, and all required impacts have been addressed. The applicant is proposing a 127-foot tower The tower will meet the setbacks for both property lines and lease lines. Findings of fact, the findings necessary for approval as listed in this report are incorporated herein as findings of fact. The property is currently zoned agricultural. The applicant has provided a complete application. The applicant has submitted a statement allowing Albany County to install a communications antenna on the tower if needed. The applicant has noted that in the event the facility is no longer being used or abandoned, the owner will be responsible for removal of the facility. Documentation has been provided that ensures that density standard levels are not exceeded. The applicant has provided a copy of the construction plan certified by an engineer licensed in Wyoming. The foundation design must be submitted and approved by the county engineer prior to construction. Conclusions of law, the provisions of the Albany County Zoning Resolution, Chapter 5, Section 5, and Chapter 5, Section 9 have been met. Staff analysis is that the applicant has satisfactorily addressed all Albany County standards for tower permitting. The applicant still will need to follow all further Albany County construction requirements as they proceed. And our recommendation is to approve the Inventive Wireless LLC DBA VistaBeam Herrick Lane Tower Permit Application LUCT 0121 based upon and incorporating the findings of fact and conclusions of law as stated in the staff report.
Joe, thank you. Are there any questions for Joe from the commission? Mr. Hinckley?
Yeah, I've got 3 or 4 pages here. No, just kidding. I just wanted to thank Joe. I think it was a very comprehensive review, and he compiled the letters from their agencies well. So I have no questions. And again, thanks staff for their good work.
Thank you, Mr. Hinckley. Ms. Hanning?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Joe, can you remind me, were there lights on this tower?
I don't believe so, but Drew is here. He can answer any questions as well.
Yeah, no, there won't be any lighting required on the tower.
Okay, thanks. No more questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. Mr. Spiegelberg, any questions on this application?
None.
None from Mr. Spiegelberg. Mr. Kennedy?
Yes. Joe, we dealt with an application from Inventive Wireless here within the last couple of months. And it was actually after the fact. Has that application been resolved? I know there was some discussion of a fine on that.
Dave, might want to do this.
We approved, or the Board of County Commissioners approved the application. And so we did not go through the enforcement process for that previous application.
And I'm assuming this one is fact. Is that accurate?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
This application is before the fact that anything had commenced. Is that accurate?
To our knowledge, yes.
Yes, that's correct. There's been no work done at the site at all.
Thanks.
Thank you. No questions for me for staff. And Mr. Wicker, as we got you on there, is there anything that you would like to address the commission on?
No, I don't think I have any questions or concerns or comments. The process seemed pretty thorough. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for answering questions and being here today.
You're welcome.
At this point, I'll go ahead and open this up to public comment. If there's anybody that from the public that would like to comment on this public application, again, please raise your hand on the right side of the screen on the column. You don't have to raise your hand in person. But I'll get a little bit of time here for people to public that want to comment. Seeing that there is none, at this point, we'll go ahead and move forward. What I'm looking for from the commission is either a motion for a recommendation of approval, a motion for recommendation of denial, or a motion to table this public application.
Kennedy, I would move to recommend approval of the Vista Beam Eric Lane Tower application LUCT 0421 to the Board of County Commissioners, incorporating the findings of fact and conclusions of law as listed in the staff report.
Second.
I would so second.
A second. Is there any member of the commission that would like to have discussion? We have a motion for recommendation for approval. Mr. Hinckley?
No, thank you. I'm good.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Hinckley. Ms. Hanning?
No, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Hanning. Mr. Spiegelberg?
None.
Mr. Kennedy?
None.
And none for myself. I'll go ahead and call roll for a vote. Mr. Hinckley?
Aye.
Ms. Hanning?
Aye.
Mr. Spiegelberg?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy?
Aye.
And Chairman Moore, myself, aye. Motion carries. Congratulations, Mr. Wicker. Your application will move on to the Board of County Commissioners.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on to public application B. But before we do, I actually have a question, Mr. Gertsch. I have a question for you. And this is probably for Adam, our IT guy. Our meeting today, and in the past, our session has been not really limited. You have to kind of put a time frame on. Are we safe time-wise at this point?
Yeah, we've got it set up till midnight, so we should be good.
Okay, very good. You answered my
Just joking.
question.
I don't know what the limit, there's not really a limit, so we're good to keep going.
Okay, well, I just don't, we're coming down to D and E, and we're going to have a lot of public comment on item F, and there's going to be a lot of time we're going to have to spend on this. And we're an hour and a half into this meeting. And so we need to keep that in mind, because the people who are on, a lot of them are here to comment on that. And so with D and E that we're going to do, we have seen these applications before. Unfortunately, we did not see those applications, or Ms. Hanning and Mr. Hinckley didn't see those applications, because I believe they came to us prior to you guys joining our board. And I'm not trying to rush you, but I just wanted to make sure that we have plenty of time for public comment and to hear, everybody speak. So item D, Ivanoff Land Use Change Application LUC-06-20, Mr. Gertsch.
Yeah, okay, so like you said, these are coming back from last year's meetings, both the Ivanoff, and it looks like I've got a wrong meeting date on one of the staff reports, but it was the fall of last year that we reviewed both of these. So the first one is the Ivanoff land use or zoning change. They're requesting small lot residential. Their current zoning is rural residential. They want to change it to small lot residential. They actually own, there's two properties out there, two lots, and what they're doing is asking for a change to small residential so that they can get a third lot out of the two existing lots. So there'll be three altogether instead of the two that exist out there. So the findings for approval, obviously they provided the site plans and application is required. Comprehensive plan, this isn't a priority growth area 1, which is near the city. It's within the city's urban growth area. That obviously this is a growth efficient place, or this meets the definition of growth efficiency. And then those similar long range growth plan objectives of development patterns that are efficient and logically sequenced to be efficiently served by public services, and that this will fulfill needs of for current and future residences. And then obviously there was a number of the same impacts you go through with this application. So the change of zoning to allow greater density is similar to the rest of the area that's been developed along Carryland Lane. There are multiple lots with lot sizes that are around 2 acres in this area, and the current and proposed zoning districts are intended for residential uses. And this proposal will not create any incompatible uses. Screening and buffering, because it's near other residential, it's residential around there. There's no screening buffering that's required. See if there's anything else that I just want to point out. So the approval of a small wastewater permit will be required from the county prior to installation of the additional wastewater systems. And then the road impacts. So the applicant has provided additional documentation of legal access to the property. The Albany County Attorney's Office determined this documentation to be, if the Albany County Attorney's Office determines this documentation to be sufficient, then the impact has been sufficiently addressed. And that was the issue. So the issue with this application and the subdivision application was whether there was actually legal access to the property. And that documentation has been provided. Staff has reviewed it. It looks like it has that, but we would need the county attorney to chime in on that. But findings of fact, or I would just say the impacts with, other than the road issue, as long as the access issue is taken care of, then all of the impacts have been addressed in staff's opinion. And the findings necessary, or findings of fact, the findings necessary for approval as listed in the staff report are incorporated here as findings of fact. The notice has been provided in accordance with the zoning resolution. Conclusions of law, the applicant is proceeding in accordance with the requirements of the Albany County zoning resolution. So this application again was tabled to determine whether legal access exists to this property. And the applicant has provided the additional information on that. The proposal is consistent with the development along Carryland Lane in that the proposed uses are residential and the density is consistent with the lots to the east. This property is contiguous to the City of Laramie municipal boundary on its north property line. The City of Laramie does not provide water or sewer services to this area, nor to my knowledge do they have an immediate plans to do so. This proposal is in priority growth area 1, which suggests that this area may be annexed in the future. It is not clear if or when the annexation of this area will occur. It does make sense for this property. It doesn't make sense to annex just this property. If annexation were to occur in the future, it would make the most sense if all the properties along here are annexed at the same time. The purpose of the priority growth areas is to direct development to the most cost-efficient areas of the county, and PGA 1 is designated the highest priority area for development to occur. This area is growth efficient in the following ways. It is near schools, emergency services, existing roads, power, and the area is already developed for residential purposes. Ultimately, this proposal will add one additional lot to the area. The property currently consists of 2 legal parcels. The potential addition of 1 lot should have minimal impacts to the area. If legal access can be determined from the documentation provided by the applicant, this application has met all of the requirements of the zone change and is consistent with the Albany County Comprehensive Plan. So staff's recommendation is approval, based on the fact that we can, if the county attorney can say that, yes, this has legal access, then staff is recommending approval.
Chairman.
Thank you, Dave, Mr. Gerch. Ms. Curran, would you give us your thoughts on the access?
Yes, thanks, Chairman Moore. I apparently can't figure out how to raise my hand on Zoom tonight. But so with reviewing the documentation, the additional documentation that was provided regarding the easements and the access on that property and the other properties out there, I don't believe that from our office there is any continuing concern about the ability of the Ivanoff property or any division thereof to access Carryland Lane.
Thank you, Ms. Curran. Appreciate your insight on that. Did you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you. At this point, Mr. Hinckley, Do you have any questions for staff?
Yeah, it's more just trying to catch up. In the packet, we have a staff report that's got a lot of crossouts on it and red lines. So I'm just not clear on what exactly it is. Can you help me out there? Why are there lines crossed out in your findings of fact, for example?
Yeah, Mr. Hinckley, because this was a staff report that has already been presented to the Planning and Zoning Commission, I wanted to show the changes that I made to the updated staff report. So I apologize for the confusion there.
Okay, no, you've cleared that up. So then, based on what we just heard from Ms. Curran, your staff recommendation was to approve the zoning change contingent on certain things, or am I getting my two Ivanovs mixed up? Oh, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. I think that was in the subdivision application. So no, that clears that up, and I have no further questions. Thank you.
Ms. Hanning, do you have any questions or comments for staff?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. Any questions for staff?
None.
None for Mr. Spiegelberg. Mr. Kennedy?
None.
None for myself. At this point, the application or the applicant or the applicant's representative, if they wish to address the commission, this will be their opportunity.
Hi, yes, I'm Jared Ralph with Coffee Engineering and Surveying. I'm representing the Ivanoff subdivision project. Just want to highlight that in those materials that were provided with regards to access, we provided actually two separate documents. One was a coverage determination from First American Title, the title company that Mary Ivanoff worked with when they bought the property, and our own access analysis. And those two, our office working on with our information and the documents that we had, and the First American Title office doing the same thing, came to the exact same conclusion. So that access has been implied since at least 1971 by way of Carrie Lynn Lane. So I just wanted to just give a little emphasis to that on top of addressing the commission's earlier concerns that I think we've definitively proved access to the property.
Thank you, Mr. Ralph. Are there any questions from the commission for the representative for the Ivanoff zoning change? Mr. Hinckley?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hinckley. Ms. Hanning?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. Mr. Spiegelberg?
Just to refresh my memory, that only involved two lots in question, didn't it, for access?
That would be, it's one property now consisting of 9.14 acres, and they're turning one tract into 3 tracts.
Right, and this would not generate any heavy traffic, what I can see. And we looked at this quite a while back, and that was the issue, traffic. I can't see where that's justified. That argument is justified at all.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Kennedy, any questions for the applicant?
None, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And no questions from myself for the applicant's representative. Mr. Ralph, thank you. If you'd stand by if we do come up with further questions.
Yeah.
At this point, I'll open this up to public comment. Again, raise your hand on the right column and I'll call on you. I see one hand raised right now. That is Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, if you'd like, we are ready to listen to you.
Thank you, Chairman Moore. Can you hear me?
Push your hand, Mr. Edwards. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, my name is Mitch Edwards. I'm with the law firm of Nicholas and Tangeman, and I represent David Montgomery and some other landowners that are adjacent to this proposed zoning change. I'm going to talk about the legal access issue in the subdivision permit application because that's where the issue is actually pertinent, but we do not believe that they have sufficient legal access under the requirements of either state statute or the regulations in order to subdivide their property. That doesn't impact necessarily the change in zoning. But what does impact the change in zoning, and we're very disappointed, is the lack of notice being provided with respect to this particular item being on today's agenda. In the zoning regulations at Chapter 5, Section 5, subsection C, you find the notice requirements, and those are composed of two types of notice that need to be provided. One is a mail notice requirement to contiguous property owners, which Mr. Montgomery is one and is listed, and there are some others, Mr. Martinez, the city of Laramie, and so forth. But the language specifically provides that notice be given by certified mail of pending proposals before the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Board of County Commissioners at least 14 days prior to consideration. And then they're to provide an affidavit at least 5 days prior to the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, showing that that certified mail was sent, and also providing signed return receipts of the notice. And I can tell you that Mr. Montgomery, as of today, has not received any notifications of this particular item by certified mail. He did receive notifications of the prior meetings back in the fall of 2020, but that does not meet the requirement under the current regulations. The only reason why I'm here today is because I was to be here for the wind energy permit issue and saw this on the agenda item, but my client was not provided notice. The second notice that's required is a notice of publication in the local newspaper at least 14 days prior to the Planning and Zoning Commission and prior to the Board of County Commissioners. Both of the notices are required to provide the name of the owner, the location, proposed use, contact information for planning department, the location, date, and time, and reviewing body for the public meeting or hearing. When I did a search of the Laramie Boomerang, who's the newspaper for publications, as it comes to the Ivanhoe application, there was not any public notices found with respect to the condition or the change in zoning found. There were 2 notices that were found for the subdivision permit that are wholly inadequate, but those were published back in June and July of 2020, relating to unidentified meetings.
Mr.
So,
Edwards, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm gonna. And we get the point that that there isn't proper notification. We'll talk to Mr. Gertz about that. But do you have anything to say to emphasize why you still do not believe that there's adequate access? Any definitive, anything definitive that we could go by that you could prove that there's no definitive access?
Mr. Chairman, yes, there is. And I can provide that to you. Quite frankly, the documents that are provided do not grant any easements to this particular property. They grant easements to other properties along that road and reserve and agree that maybe in the future additional easements would be granted, but there's no such grant. But outside of that, when we get to the subdivision application, I'll show you specifically that the access that we're talking about is not adequate access required by your statutes and regulations to grant a subdivision permit. But like I said, those are pertinent specifically to the subdivision application.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Gertz. And maybe this, and Miss Curran, I guess. So number one, Mr. Gertz, is the accusations that Mr. Edwards saying true? And if so, because this is coming back before us, and I believe before we did approve this subdivision, what are the requirements for the notice given? Because to be honest with you, I was actually quite surprised to see these to agenda today because this commission's already, and not this commission with Ms. Hanning, Mr. Hinckley, but prior to that, had approved this subdivision. Why do we have this again here today in front of us?
Okay, so first, the reason you have this today is because you tabled it at your meeting in October. I'm pretty sure it was October 14th meeting. You tabled it at that time. And at that meeting was properly noticed, received all of that stuff. We did the signage, the certified mail, as well as the publication in the paper for that meeting. Typically, once an application is tabled, we don't go back to publish again. We don't do that again. We take it to another meeting and then it comes back up and then we go through the process. The difference between that and some of the other ones, obviously, is that there was some time between the tabling and then bringing it back to discuss again. But I feel like the regulations were met because we properly noticed the previous meeting, and this is just bringing these back to the table because you did not make a decision on these applications at the time because of the issues with the access. So that's why both of them were tabled by the applicant, and then we were asked to be tabled, and you tabled it and we brought it back. So
okay, and so was I in error that we didn't bring, statutorily with applications, was I in error that if we did this in October, and I guess I am in error because I thought, and now it's coming back to me that we did table it, but was I in error that we didn't have this on or in statutorily? Are we wrong because we didn't bring this up within a certain certain number of days?
no, because the applicant requested this to provide additional information. And so it wasn't until the applicant had that information that they asked to bring it back on the table, basically.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gertz. Ms. Curran?
Yes, Chairman Moore.
As far as your understanding of the statutes and the regulations and the rules of Albany County, as far as the notice that's going out that Mr. Edwards had informed us of, do you feel that you're comfortable with this application at this point?
Yes, because in Chapter 5, it does say that there are 14 days prior to consideration and at least 5 days prior to consideration. There's nothing in the county regulations that gives a timeline, like an end date timeline. So some of the statutes and regulations say at least 14 days, but not more than 60 days. And there's no such notice requirement in this Section 5. So I believe Mr. Gertz is correct that the prior notice meets the obligations within the regulations.
All right, thank you, Ms. Curran. Mr. Edwards, I see your hands up. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to address that quickly. I believe the Planning and Zoning Commission is considering that here today, and they're to provide at least 14 days notice before consideration. Also, the contents of the notice specify that the notice is to provide the location, date, and time and reviewing body of the public meeting. None of the notices that were sent before had this date and time for this particular meeting. And here we are, well over 7 months since it was last tabled with no date specific. And I would wholly disagree that notice back in July and June of 2020 for a meeting last fall is sufficient for the public notice for this particular consideration in this meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I appreciate your comment.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Can I just ask the applicant, Mr. Ralph, if this is going to be a point of contention, would you feel more comfortable if we re-advertise this and come back to the next meeting, or would you like to move forward?
I'd like to move forward if possible. We're talking about extended timelines. we've had essentially the intent of this project is so that Mary's daughter could build a house on one of these lots that's being created. Due to this backup, her daughter's essentially been homeless for the last couple of months. I know that's where I'm coming from on a professional standpoint, where it's okay. I don't think I can go back to my client and say it was tabled on a technicality, but we feel better about that. I don't think it's in really anyone's best interest. Mr. Edwards is here representing Mr. Montgomery and the other interested neighbors. So I would like to push forward if possible.
Thank you, Mr. Ralph. At this point, I'm going to go around and I see your hands up, Mr. Edwards, but I'm going to go ahead and ask everybody on the Planning Commission what their thoughts are. Mr. Hinckley?
Yikes. Well, I'm certainly sympathetic to this proposal, but rolling it in with the subdivision, it sounds like which I have a number of questions on. Certainly feel for the schedule here, but I wonder if we really don't want to get too far down into another one of these. Do you have legal access? You've got an adverse recommendation from DEQ on your Chapter 23. You've got some letters going back and forth between you and the city. I guess, to be responsive to your question, Mr. Chairman, I'm kind of nervous about this package. Maybe we could approve the zoning, but not the subdivision. But would that really be helpful? So I'm confused.
Okay, so let me clarify my question, Mr. Hinckley. Would you feel comfortable moving forward in a vote today?
With the zoning proposition more so than the subdivision, yes.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hanning?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a complicated issue for sure. I just do want to point out that Mr. Toro, when he put off his application to this meeting, he did renotice all the adjacent landowners. It seems like a really long time has elapsed since it was in front of the commission, and it's just sort of happenstance that Mr. Edwards is on the call. But I can see Mr. Ralph's point that, well, hey, Mr. Edwards is on the call. He's here to defend his clients, but I'm sure he would have preferred to be more prepared to do that defense. So I'm in a conundrum, but you already know where I stand about septic tank leach fields on small lots and making them smaller. So I don't know if my opinion matters because I'm going to be voting no on both of these. So you can take that into consideration, I guess, on how you want to go forward.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. How do you feel about, and more of my question is how do you feel about moving forward, just having a vote?
I feel like I have enough information to make a vote.
Okay. Mr. Spiegelberg?
I'm satisfied to proceed.
Yes,
As am I.
Okay, very good. I see that Mr. Edwards' hands up and Mr. Ralph's hands up. And so what I'm going to do here is we're going to listen to both of them. And then we're probably going to ask Ms. Curran question, and then we're going to go ahead and take a vote. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to clarify for everybody my representation and point out that on the contiguous property owners, their list, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people listed or entities listed. I represent Mr. Montgomery. I do not represent the city of Laramie. I do not represent Country Club LLC. I do not represent Dennis and Patricia Butler, nor do I represent David and Robert and Belinda Bacon. I don't know if any of those properties have sold in the intervening time such that there's different owners now or not, but I don't represent any of those contiguous owners. I only represent Mr. Montgomery as far as that list is concerned.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Ralph, anything you'd like to add?
I just wanted to address Mr. Hinckley's concerns. we have addressed the DEQ adverse recommendation, and we have turned in our request to. What happened is that, from what I understand, it was the land had agricultural irrigation, and we were abandoning that. We got that request into DEQ. We have addressed our comments with the city of Laramie regarding the growth area, and that what the city sees as our client's responsibilities there. Essentially, our position, and they agreed with us on this, is that the scope of the project is to subdivide land. There's not construction happening at this moment. There's not construction happening until, this gets approved. It would not be within the scope of building a house to bring in water and sewer to the property as the city of Laramie has requested. I know that there's some utility access to the north, but in the city limits, but it would require either bringing utility services down Vista Drive, essentially from Walmart to Carolyn Lane Road, or trying to get an easement across someone else's land. So we've addressed those major concerns, and the most current one being DEQ. So I just wanted to address your concerns on that.
Thank you, Mr. Ralph. And just a reminder, we're under the public comment period of a portion of this public application, D. Is there anybody else public who should speak on this item? Not saying any, I'll go ahead and close it. There's probably a reason why there's no public comment, because of the snafu and public, notice that was sent out. But with that being said, I feel like our board has came to a conclusion that we'll go ahead and take a vote on this. So at this,
Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me for 1 second. I apologize. Mr. Kennedy has a question for Mr. Ralph.
Yeah.
And, I apologize.
When I looked through the report, and I just soon answer this question now, have you also filed with the Board of Control for the plan on the existing water right? Because that was DEQ's question. So you have filed with the Board of Control.
We have filed with groundwater. That we have an environmental engineer that we work with on this. His name is Ben Jordan with Weston Engineering. And he has headed that up. I have provided support for him while I'm working on the plat. But we, according to our advisors, we have submitted the proper submittals to Wyoming DEQ.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ralph. At this point, we'll go ahead and move forward with this application. At this point, I guess I'm looking for a motion from members of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Motion for recommendation of approval of the zoning change, or a motion for denial of the zoning change, or tabling this issue, which I believe we already have done. Mr. Spiegelberg?
Yes, I would like to make a motion for the recommendation of approval of the Ivanoff zoning change application, LUC-06-20, to the Board of County Commissioners, incorporating the findings of fact and conclusions of law as listed in the staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Spiegelberg. So we have a motion now for approval. Do we have a second?
Kennedy, second.
So we got a first and a second. Any discussion from members of the Planning and Zoning Commission? Mr. Hinckley? None from Mr. Hinckley.
Good.
Mr. Hinckley, do you have a question or comment? Discussion?
No, I was just stumbling to unmute there. I'm good. Move on. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Ms. Hanning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have anything to add.
All right, thank you. Mr. Spiegelberg?
None.
None. From Mr. Kennedy?
None, thank you.
All right, very good. We'll go ahead and call vote. Mr. Hinckley?
Aye.
Ms. Hanning?
No.
Mr. Spiegelberg?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy?
Aye.
And Chairman Moore, myself, aye. So motion carries 4-1. This issue will be brought forward to the Board of County Commissioners. This leads into the next public application, which is the Ivanhoff subdivision application SD-05-20. And David, do you care to go forward?
All right, so Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, so this again is the same property, 3933 Carrie Lynn Lane. They're requesting approval of a preliminary and final plat and a subdivision permit. With the approval of the Board of County Commission for small lot zoning, this will be small lot residential and will allow this subdivision to occur. Access for this is directly off of Carrie Lynn Lane. A number of folks reviewed this. Bill Gorman reviewed it and had some comments, and those were addressed by the applicant. DEQ provided the adverse recommendation, and yeah, it was about water rights. That was why they denied that. And so if they're relinquishing those water rights, that should take care of that. And then the state engineer's office, their review is based on the same thing, that the water rights weren't properly relinquished or done something with the water rights, apparently. So, and then this is within the 1 mile of the city of Laramie. And so according to state statute, they do have the opportunity to comment on this. And they did provide a request. They requested denial of the subdivision based on the Laramie Comprehensive Plan. And then if you want to see all their comments, they're in there as well. In the back, I think you probably read through those. The comprehensive plan, again, this is PGA 1. This is a growth efficient area. Growth, land use objective 1 and 3 are basically being fulfilled through approval of this. So water wise, there's a domestic well that currently exists on the proposed lot 2 and a septic system that exists on lot 2. And then they will have to install 2 new septic systems, or one for each, for lot 1 and lot 3, and then a well for lot 1 and lot 3. Rocky Mountain Power provides utilities, power for that property. The postal service, let's see. Yeah, a review from the postal service. I'm not sure if I've received that yet. They've already established postal service in that area. Let's see, roads. No new roads are being proposed. Carrie Lynn Lane's a private lane. And then they have legal access according to documentation and according to our county attorney's determination. Road maintenance. So this road, because it's a privately maintained road, there's a road maintenance agreement that's required. They have drafted an agreement. One of the things that we're asking is that this agreement be fully executed prior to the final approval of the plan, and that it be filed with the application, I should say, and then be filed with the Albany County Clerk at that time. Financial improvements or assurances, nothing's required for this. They're not making any improvements. The road exists already. Fire protection, because this is only a 3-lot subdivision, they're waived by the fire warden. Water rights, again, the applicant is in the process of abandoning the surface water rights. And notice was provided. Again, this is the same situation as the zoning change. It was provided before the last meeting, and then the application was tabled, and then it was brought back today. Findings of fact, the summary of subdivision requirements listed in the staff report shall be incorporated as findings of fact. The applicant qualifies to be reviewed as a small subdivision in accordance with the Albany County Plat and Subdivision Regulations. And then the preliminary and final plats comply with the Albany County Plat and Subdivision Regulations. Conclusions of law, the applicant is proceeding in accordance with the requirements of the Albany County Platting and Subdivision Regulations. So this subdivision is being proposed in an area that was previously developed. The density and the lot sizes that will result from the subdivision are consistent with surrounding properties. And this property currently consists of 2 parcels, and the subdivision proposal will create an additional property and move property lines. A review of the Albany County Comprehensive Plan shows that this proposal is in Priority Growth Area 1, the most desirable area for additional development. And the proposal is growth efficient and meets the 2 long-range growth plan land use objectives. So the city of Laramie is asking for denial of this application based on non-conformance with the city of Laramie Comprehensive Plan. The city of Laramie has interpreted the statutes 3412 103B to require that the city and county comprehensive plans be applied as regulation within 1 mile of the city limits. The county has thus far taken a different stance on that. And I think the statutes, the change in statutes that will go into effect, confirm that, that in regards to how we can use comprehensive plans in our land use planning and regulations. And so unfortunately, this statute itself has not been, there's no case law, so nobody's taken this to court to see what it really means. But I will note that the city of Laramie has previously supported county development in Priority Growth Area 1. They approved a number of subdivisions, the Vista Butte subdivisions in Priority Growth Area 1, the Royal View subdivision, and the J&R Laramie Industrial Park were all approved when the city actually had jurisdiction to say yes or no on the subdivisions. So just to point that out, and each of these subdivisions were approved by the city of Laramie without any request for annexation. And yeah, that's about it for that. So staff's recommending approval of the preliminary and final plats and the subdivision permit for the Ivanhoe subdivision with the contingent that we receive a fully executed road maintenance agreement on the surface rights of the property, and the surface rights of the property be properly abandoned prior to final approval of the Board of County Commissioners. So it sounds like they've got the surface rights kind of taken care of. So I guess we're just waiting on a letter that confirms that. So is there any questions for myself on this application?
Thank you, Mr. Gertz. I think we have one from, and her hand's been up, is from our attorney, Ms. Curran.
Thanks, Chairman Moore. I wanted to clarify, when I spoke with David before, I missed the section in the subdivision regulations in Chapter 4, Section 5, C3, which says that we do need to have the subdivision agreement or the road maintenance agreement in place. However, the absence of that does not disqualify the applicant from subdivision approval if the board finds that reasonable efforts have been made and documented by the applicant to enter into that road maintenance contract. And then there are examples of proof of reasonable efforts. So if it's possible, I'd like to amend what I had told David before, that we either need them to have that final agreement when they get to the county commissioners, or they need to be able to discuss with the commissioners their reasonable efforts that have been made and documented in an attempt to get that road maintenance agreement.
Thank you, Ms. Curran. Mr. Kennedy, and I do see your hand up, Mr. Hinckley. I'm going to go to Mr. Kennedy here first. Mr. Kennedy.
And Jennifer, I've got a question, and David said that there wasn't any case law on point. And I guess my question is, I'd argue that Asphalt Specialties is case law on point, even in the absence until that statute's effective July 1st. Am I accurate there?
I'm sorry. I missed that part. I was turning off my heater because it was too loud. What was it that David said there was no case law?
David mentioned that there wasn't any case law on point about use of the comprehensive plan. And I'd argue that there is with asphalt specialties that can't have bearing on it. Am I thinking accurately?
I do agree with you. I think there is case law on point that the comprehensive plan cannot be determinative. They're asphalt specialties. And then there are also cases prior to that as well, where the court in Wyoming has been very clear that land use plans or comprehensive plans are guiding documents, but unless they are incorporated into zoning resolutions, they cannot be what determinations are made off of for boards as they move forward.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
So I would just add what I was saying is that that specific statute, there's no case law. There's not been a court case for that specific statute. Now, what Mr. Kennedy is saying and Ms. Curran is saying, I would agree. I mean, there's actually a lot of case law out there that says that you can't use a comprehensive plan. Some of it was created in this county many years ago, so that you cannot use a comprehensive plan as regulations. But that statute is worded kind of funky, and so we've never had anything from that specific one. But if you can apply those other cases to that statute, then yeah. So just want to clarify.
Hold on.
Did you have him give me that site again?
Mr. Gertz, Mr. Kendi has a question.
Could you give me that site again? I'd like to look that up real quick.
The citation?
Yeah.
Okay, it's 3412 103, and it's B.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Gertz. Mr. Hinckley, your hand's been up. Go ahead, comments, questions for staff.
Yeah, I guess several. One, I'd like to hear a crisp answer from Ms. Curran on the road access issue. But I'm also hearing that the DEQ adverse situation has been resolved. What they actually said in their letter was a complete review was not conducted due to the lack of water rights assigned to the applicant. I would take that to mean that they never looked at the septic system at all and did not provide an analysis of that. So maybe it's a question for Mr. Ralph. And in any case, I would like to see a non-adverse judgment from DEQ to complete this package. I'd also like to be convinced that they have adequate access. And I'm uncomfortable with kicking the can down the road with respect to the road maintenance agreement. So I guess I'm hearing a motion to go forward with a Christmas tree of conditions associated with it, which I'll have to say makes me uncomfortable. And then a specific question with respect to the packet we received. There's a letter from the city dated August 28th. Then there is an undated letter marked draft, apparently to Todd Fieser from Commissioner Gosar. I'm unclear on the status of that. When I had opportunity to ask Mr. Gosar about it, he had no memory of ever signing such a letter. So yet another loose end. What is this thing that I'm looking at that says draft letter to Mr. Fieser from Mr. Gosar? So maybe you could answer the last point at least and respond to my other concerns. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I can answer the letter part. The letter was drafted by staff. I mean, Mr. Gosar hasn't signed it because he hasn't seen it yet. And you know, what is being provided doesn't have to be signed by him. I mean, he could change it however he likes. But one of the requirements is that if we did approve this subdivision, if the Board of County Commissioners do approve it, then they do have to address their concerns. And so that's just the template, or, you know, a starting point for whatever that the board comes out of the board, you know.
Did it go to Fieser or not? Is it just a thing?
No, it did not go to Mr. Fieser.
Okay.
It's a draft letter.
Okay, so it's your explanation to us of your potential response to FESR.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Gertz, the first question that Mr. Hinckley had there with the, and Mr. Hinckley can help me out here, but your first question, I think we didn't address there, was the adverse from DEQ. And did you pose that in a question to Mr. Gertz?
Or Mr. Ralph.
Oh, you said Mr. Ralph. And
Mr. Ralph said that they had worked with DEQ, and I don't know what that means. And in any case, I'd like to see it in paper. What's the story?
Very good. Well, Mr. Ralph, we'll get to you in a second here. Hold on, just order here. And remind me, Mr. Hinckley, because we're going to, you're going to have your opportunity to ask him that question and get that answered. Ms. Hanning, any questions for staff?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a question for Mr. Gertz. Were Mr. Gorman's comments about surface drainage addressed?
Yes, he addressed all of the applicant addressed his comments.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have nothing further. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. Mr. Spiegelberg, any questions on this application for staff?
None.
Mr. Kennedy?
None further, thank you.
Okay. No questions from me on at this point with this application. And so, Mr. Ralph, at this point, we're going to go to the applicant's representative, Mr. Ralph. Mr. Ralph, you heard what Mr. Hinckley had said. If Mr. Hinckley, if you want to clarify that for Mr. Ralph so he can answer your question.
Let's hear what he has to say. If you want the clarification, I'll provide.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so I have, we turned into the state engineer's office and, I'm sorry, to the groundwater division at DEQ an elimination request to eliminate, let me see here, irrigation use on 5 acres and reduce the pumping capacity. That was DEQ's largest hangup, was that essentially we're going to be switching to a residential residential zoning, a small lot residential zoning, and that the irrigation rights, water rights we had didn't match that zoning. So we have earlier this week filed the paperwork with DEQ to eliminate this irrigation right. I believe I'm reading that correct, Mr. Jordan's report correctly here. So that's, and that it was my understanding that that was what needed to be addressed to obtain a non-adverse or a DEQ non-adverse recommendation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think you're saying DEQ, and what you mean is state engineer's office.
Yeah, probably that's.
But no, that is not addressed. What I saw was the adverse letter from DEQ that said we have not looked at anything because the water rights are up in the air. So
right, we're addressing the water rights. That'll get DEQ into the process, and we believe it will be a smooth process once that has been addressed. We were just not. We just had to go back and make sure that we were addressing the water rights.
But then and only then will DEQ take up the question of septic system water suitability. And they have not yet done that. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you. So we are currently standing on an adverse recommendation from DEQ and have not received a non-adverse recommendation.
Correct.
Thank you.
And then with regards to the road maintenance agreement, Ms. Curran brought up that a reasonable attempt would have to be made to get a road maintenance agreement in place. Now, what we have done is we have sent out certified mail. I have given the receipts to Mr. Gertz. I also have the return labels here. They did come back, so if those will be needed, I can provide those. but I have sent out a copy of a road maintenance agreement that was part of, that I believe was in the submittal to the county. And we received no agreements back, but we're showing that we're making our reasonable attempt to get a road maintenance agreement in place.
Thank you, Mr. Ralph. Appreciate that. Is there any other questions for Mr. Ralph for the applicant's representative, Ms. Hanning?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Ms. Hanning. Mr. Spiegelberg?
None.
No questions for Mr. Ralph. Thank you, Mr. Spiegelberg. Mr. Kennedy?
None, thank you.
And none for Mr. Kennedy, and none for myself. At this point, I'll go ahead and close that session for the representative. Mr. Ralph, if you'd stick around for a little bit here, appreciate it. I'm going to open this up just procedurally for the public. At this time, the public can comment on this. Mr. Edwards, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mitch Edwards on behalf of David Montgomery. Again, I'd raised the issue with respect to notice, but for the sake of time, I won't rehash that other than to say that the notice wasn't complied with. I want to address the access issue. One, we don't agree that the documents provided actually provide and grant legal access to this particular property. But for the sake of argument, I want you to assume that there is a legal access. What those documents and what the applicant has said is that those documents provide a 40-foot access from Vista Drive to their property. Now, the issue that your statutes and the regulations require is sufficient legal access, and you have to make a finding of sufficient legal access. What I'd like to point out to you is that Wyoming Statute 185306, which is the minimum requirements for subdivision permits, and then, under that, subsection A, Roman numeral V, provides that shall provide a minimum access roadway right-of-way of 60 feet to the subdivision for all public ways. Now, there's an exception in that statute for where a subdivision is of one or more units of land into not more than 5 units, which would be a small subdivision. And if you look at your regulations require an 80-foot minimum right-of-way. But under chapter 4, section 6, which is the small subdivision process, it provides an exception to the 80-foot minimum access and says, however, road right-of-way shall be a minimum of 50 feet. So under that provision, you do not, at 40 feet, even if that access was a 40-foot access, you do not meet the minimum requirements under either state statute or the regulations. Now, I'd also like to point out that in your regulations, you also have a provision that provides that for street standards and provides that the right-of-way, if the subdivision is located within 1 mile of a municipality, it provides the standard regarding right-of-way, roadway width, curbs and gutters, and other requirements of that municipality will also apply. And so if you go to, and it's not a may, it's a will apply. And if you go to Laramie Municipal Code 1518.00, which is general provisions for improvements, it provides that a local residential street shall be 60 feet in width and that the roadway shall be 46 or 40 feet in actual roadway width. And then it goes on to provide that there shall be full pavement for the entire width, that there shall be curb, gutter, and sidewalk on the side of the road adjoining the major subdivision. And it goes on to provide that access roads to the subdivision are also to be improved to pavement at a minimum of at least 28 feet in width. So here, the 40-foot access does not meet the requirement under the municipal standards that your regulations adopt, since it's within 1 mile. And also there's no requirements in here that are required by your regulations to require that the access be paved by the applicant, that there be curb, gutter, sidewalk, and so forth. So regardless of whether or not there is a 40-foot access from Vista Drive along Kerry Lynn Lane, that 40-foot access, if it did exist, which again, we do not believe it does, but if it did exist, is insufficient under your minimum requirements for a subdivision, no matter what provisions you're looking at, because at a minimum, it's a 50-foot width right of way or a 60-foot width right of way, and also requiring additional requirements to comply with city standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Gertsch?
Yes.
So being our planner, as far as what has been brought to light by Mr. Edwards, what are your feelings on that?
So the road exists. The applicant isn't proposing a new road. So I would say if they're proposing a new road, then yeah, they would have to build them to that standard. But at this point, the road's there. All they're doing is dividing the property. If needed, we do have a variance process, and we can provide that variance as well from that standard. But if where the road exists, this is typically what's done, and there's nothing being proposed to improve or do anything with that road. It's there. The right of way is there. It's hard for us to change something that exists. So,
thank you, Mr. Gertsch. That was a great explanation. And then Ms. Curran,
Yes, Chairman Moore.
are you turning your heater on or off? Is that what you're
It's cold in my office.
Anyways, as far as moving, let's just say we move this application on, you being the attorney for the civil attorney for the, how is your thoughts, or how do you feel based off this issue, if this ends up in court down the road between property owners? How do you feel defending the county on this particular issue of what Mr. Edwards said and what Mr. Gertsch said?
In my reading of things, I am in line with what Mr. Gertsch has said, that what we have been provided from the applicant is sufficient to my standards, especially given the letter from the title company, that adequate access is provided. And given that this is a private road and an existing road, I also agree with Mr. Gertsch that it is difficult to have someone who is using an existing road to say, because you're going to add 2 more lots, you have to improve an entire private road. It's not dedicated to the public use at all. It is a private road. So if that's the case, I agree with Mr. Gertsch that as it stands now, we have met the requirements within the zoning regulations and the subdivision regulations for what is in front of you this evening with regard to Ivanov's.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kern. I appreciate that. I'm going to open this up again, and remember, we're still under the public comment period. I'm going to give a few seconds for any other public comments, and then we're going to move forward. Seeing no other public comments, and just my thought, and being the chair and being in this unique situation, application, I feel like it is okay from the standpoint to move forward. And Mr. Edwards, I'm talking to you too. That this is just advisory. The applicant, and I can understand. I agree with some of that notice wasn't given, and we saw that with public comment on this, that there's no public comment. But being that we are just advisory and to the Board of County Commissioners, I would think that there will be a healthy discussion one way or the other, whether this passes or fails. But at the Board of County Commissioners, notice can be given in time for you to prepare, and also for the county to prepare on, what the ultimate and final outcome of this application would be. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and call for a motion from our commission. There's either a motion to recommend approval and send it to the Board of County Commissioners. Recommend a motion for recommendation of denial, or we have tabled this before, so I feel like either one or the other needs to happen today for a decision to be made. So at this point, that's what I'm looking for from this commission.
Mr. Chairman Kennedy, I will move that we recommend approval of the Ivanhoe subdivision application SD-05-20 to the Board of County Commissioners, incorporating the findings of fact and conclusions of law as listed in the staff report, subject to approval of a plan for the existing water rights that has been filed with the Board of Control.
So we have a first, a motion and a first. Do we have a?
I would so second.
And we have a second for Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Spiegelberg, excuse me. Do we have any further discussion among commission members? Mr. Hinckley?
Yeah, I cannot support this motion. I don't feel this thing is ripe to move forward, and I don't think that we're performing our role responsibly to just say, give it to the county commission and let them sort all these things out. I think there's just too many pieces of this that are hanging in the air. So no, I do not support this motion. It's not ripe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hinckley. Ms. Hanning?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also am unable to support this application for a variety of reasons, but with the DEQ still having an adverse recommendation and haven't even performed their analysis, then I think that we don't have the information to make the decision, and that it's our role to do that and not just foist it on the county commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hanning. Mr. Spiegelberg?
Aye.
Well, not your vote. Do you have any?
No, I'm sorry.
No
I thought you were
discussion.
in the vote. No,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, I know. I apologize. I should have
Okay.
told you. So just any discussion, anything, any comments or anything you want to add?
None.
Okay, none from you, Mr. Kennedy?
My comment would be that it looks like to me that the only adverse recommendation is the Board of Control has not received a plan to change the use of the water right that currently exists, and that is the only issue that DEQ has. And while they said that they didn't study it any further, you might recall our subdivision regulations do not require that for a subdivision that is less than 4. So that's the reason that I am an aye vote.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Kennedy. And I don't have anything to add to discussion. I do think that I do respect everybody's opinion, and I think that there was a lot of good conversation on this, and hearing from Mr. Edwards and also Mr. Ralph. But at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and take a vote here. And Mr. Hinckley?
No.
Ms. Hanning?
No.
Mr. Spiegelberg?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy?
Aye.
And Chairman Moore, myself, aye. So motion carries. Now motion will move forward. This approval for the preliminary and final plats and subdivision permit will move forward to the Board of County Commissioners. At this point, we're on public applications number F, or letter
Mr.
F.
Chairman?
Item, yes, sir.
I would move that we take a 10-minute recess so that other members of the commission can use the appropriate facilities.
That sounds good. So this is what our schedule will be. And everybody who's been online listening or on your phone, bear with us. We're going to take a minute break.
There might be a second voice vote for this.
So you want to take a,
Second.
okay, so we got a second from Mr. Spiegelberg. And then we'll take a vote here real quick. What we're voting on is a 10-minute break. As soon as we get done here, I'll announce the time that we're gonna come back and we're gonna dive into item F. Mr. Hinckley,
Aye.
Ms. Henning,
Aye.
Mr. Spiegelberg,
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy.
Aye.
And myself, aye. We will reconvene this meeting here. It is 6:47 is what I have. Let's just say 7 o'clock. We're going to start this meeting again and take care of items that you need to take care of. And then we're going to dive into rail tie wind project application. And we'll talk to everybody here shortly.